Good morning, you guys. So it is 6 o'clock in the morning, and we just had a snow day, and I decided why not make some World War II videos since I love making videos. So I found out that I actually made a bunch of videos last year that I finally saved, but that was when I was still kind of new at making videos. So it was a little rough, some of them, but you'll still get the point. So I'm going to just play those. And I also need to add a new video about one part, which I will be adding into that. So enjoy learning about World War II. Let's get this started.
So we are talking about chapter 24, section 5. It's called the rise of totalitarianism. If you guys remember that totalitarianism means that the government is going to do whatever they need to have total control over everything. And that might include using violence against people or anything else that they might feel they need. So we're first going to talk about Latin America before we get into more of what was going on in Europe, just so you can understand where the United States was at and where the rest of the world was at before World War II started. So before World War II, the United States had complicated relationships with Latin America. So you guys know that Latin America would be like South America, including Mexico and anything underneath us. So in the past, the United States had used different policies so that they could control Latin America and benefit unequally from Latin America. However, right before World War II started, FDR had decided to use economic influence rather than military force in Latin America to promote trade and cultural exchanges. He canceled this thing called the Platt Amendment, which I'm going to explain, which the U.S. had used to intervene in Cuba. So the Platt Amendment basically said that the United States would help Cuba to be free from the Spanish. So the Spanish used to colonize Cuba in exchange for the U.S. basically being able to control Cuba. So he canceled the Platt Amendment and he replaced it with just a requirement for the United States to be allowed to rent land from Cuba in Guantanamo Bay. So that's why actually we still have a prison in Guantanamo Bay, and that's because of us helping Cuba get free from the Spanish during the Spanish-American War. He also removed troops from Haiti. After the United States started kind of leaving Latin America, a lot of dictators began to take control in Cuba, El Salvador, Guatemala, and Nicaragua. And a lot of that had to do with the same reasons that dictators were coming to power in Europe, and that's because there had been a Great Depression there as well. Mexico nationalized the oil industry, but later agreed to pay oil companies for the property. The problem with that is that a lot of those oil companies were owned by the United States. So as we discussed last week, there was a rise of totalitarianism in Europe and Asia, which is the political system where the government controls every aspect of citizens' lives. In Italy, Benito Mussolini took power. He was a former soldier who took over the Italian government. The people who followed him were called black shirts. He established a form of government in Italy called fascism, where a single person leads the state or government, and they see that the state is more important than individuals. So a lot of times a fascist country will be very racist. They will also use whatever means necessary to control the government, and usually that includes like getting rid of any opponents. It's usually totalitarianism. In October of 1935, Italy conquered the African nation of Ethiopia. Germany, on the other hand, World War I reparations and repressions had ruined their economy, and Adolf Hitler took advantage of that. He was a World War I vet and politician who gained a following by claiming that he could restore Germany to its former glory. Hitler blamed Germany's problems on communist Jews and intellectuals. The people who followed him were called Nazis. Before they were called Nazis, they were called brown shirts. It stood for Hitler's National Socialist Party, which was elected to power in 1932. Hitler became the German Chancellor in 1933 and then became a dictator. Under Nazi rule, Germany violated the Treaty of Versailles by rebuilding its army and seizing territory in former land that had been taken away from them, first in Alsace-Lorraine, and then later he began to take over little bits of land in Poland. The Axis powers was a group of people who had made a military alliance between Germany and Italy, and later it was going to add Japan when World War II starts. The Nazis deprived Jews of their citizenship and took their property, and all-out violence broke out against Jews on November 9th of 1938 on a night known as Kristallnacht. It means Night of the Broken Glass, where Nazis demolished Jewish businesses and destroyed their synagogues in Germany and Austria. Around the same time, Japan invaded Manchuria in northern China in 1931. They also began to build up their navy in violation of something called the Washington Conference Pledge. Remember, I told you that the United States, along with several other countries, had promised to reduce the size of their navies in order to try to keep world peace. Japan was one of those countries, and they violated that. They controlled most of China by 1937 by taking the emperor as their hostage and using him as their puppet. Although the United States condemned Japan's actions, most Americans were against or opposed using force against Japan. Roosevelt wanted to stop aggression without going to war. So public opinion about going to war, most people remembered World War I and favored a policy of isolationism. It means that we would keep to ourselves and not get involved in other countries' problems. So Congress passed 4 neutrality acts to keep the United States out of international conflicts, and that included not giving loans to countries at war. As totalitarian states grew more aggressive, some people wanted the United States to enter the war, and that is.
So what you should be picking up is that nobody wanted to go to war. That there were some European countries, and especially Japan as well, who were making some very aggressive moves. So this section is going to just talk about how all of that stuff leads to war. Okay, so in 1938, Hitler is going to force Austria to unite with Germany, which actually Hitler was Austrian. He wasn't actually German. So it was natural that he wanted those two countries together. Also, remember those two countries had been very close allies during World War I. They also had a lot of kind of like common heritage, so it was natural for them to be together as well. And then Hitler starts making some pretty big demands. So what we're going to see is that all European countries, I think, and the United States wanted to prevent war. So what they're going to do is they're going to just keep kind of giving him little bits of what he wanted and hoping that he would just be satisfied with that and just stop there so that there didn't have to be a war. But the problem with that is that Hitler was not planning on stopping. Like he wanted to go to war. He didn't mind that. So one of the first steps that he took was he demanded that Czechoslovakia return an area of land called the Sudetenland, which had a lot of like ethnic Germans in it, to Germany and threatened war when the Czechs refused. I believe also that that area used to belong to the Germans before World War I ended. So he just thought, hey, that used to be ours, we should get it back. In an effort to try to make Hitler happy because Europe, France, Britain, the United States saw that he was a threat, in 1938, they had a conference in Munich, Germany, and they agreed to give the Sudetenland back to Germany. Um, so all of this, like trying to keep him happy thing, they called that appeasement. So it's a policy of appeasement, just like giving someone little bits and hoping that they'll just stop. And Winston Churchill, who was a really famous British politician, he was the Prime Minister of the UK. He said that that was a terrible idea because he believed that Hitler would never be satisfied with what he was given. And then after the Sudetenland, Hitler also demanded that Poland return the city of Danzig to Germany. So this is showing that he wasn't going to be just satisfied with little bits. However, this is where France and Great Britain kind of began to say no. Like they pledged that they would defend Poland. They did not want to give that over to Hitler. In August of 1939, Germany and the Soviet Union met and made a secret pact. Remember that the Soviet Union is also known as Russia. Once Russia became communist and they started kind of like gathering the countries around them and making them part of the Soviet Union because they weren't all necessarily Russia, but now they were the Soviet Union because Russia was its own country and it started including a bunch of the surrounding countries, and that was called the Soviet Union. So when they made the secret agreement, they agreed not to attack each other, and they wanted to divide Poland. So they were already planning to invade. So World War II officially starts when Germany invaded Poland on September 1st of 1939, and then Russia is going to invade the other side. Because they had pledged to protect Poland, France and Britain, which were known as the Allied powers, declared war on Germany. Okay, so you guys, I hope this is sounding familiar because this is really similar to World War One. Remember, there were secret agreements, which is going to lead to a war. There was the buildup of military power, which, by the way, before World War II, that was happening in Germany. And there was, okay, what am I missing here? Yeah, maybe I didn't miss anything. Okay, so what Germany did when the war started is they started using a style of war called Blitzkrieg. It's German for lightning war. So the idea is that the Germans would like use all kinds of different things to attack and overwhelm their enemy because they wanted to like move quickly and surprise attack their enemy and like use overwhelming force to quickly break through enemy lines and um, advance their line, which actually worked very well at first. In fact, I think Germany believed, just like before World War One, that if they used Blitzkrieg, um, that they could just win that war really quickly because they just like went all out all at once. The problem is going to be that that uses like a lot of energy. Okay, so the war begins to collect along the line called the Maginot Line, which was where like France was expecting Germany to try to invade France. Okay, so you can see that kind of here, and you'll see it on the next page. Um, so Germany was smart, and rather than trying to like hit France head on where France was expecting it, they decided to go around France. So here's that line where France was preparing for war. So Germany decided to invade Belgium, which wasn't a threat to them at the time. They just invaded Belgium and they went around the line and they quickly moved using Blitzkrieg and started moving toward Paris. Um, so that actually worked so well that France surrendered to Germany on June 22nd of 1940. So that was really a fast movement for Germany. Then they set their eyes on Great Britain, which was their second major enemy. So for 2 months, they attacked Great Britain over and over and over and over again, and it was called the Battle of Britain. The British ended up winning that simply by outlasting outlasting Germany. The other thing was that Great Britain is an island, as you can see, like right here. This is so the UK is an island, and in Hitler's style of fighting using blitzkrieg, he needed tanks. He needed his ground forces. Otherwise, he was only fighting with partial energy. So here's the larger version of that, the Maginot Line. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. Germany invades through Belgium to get around, like actually facing the French head on, and they quickly attack and take over. Back in the day, if you wanted to invade a country and like take over, all you had to do was invade their um, capital city, and then you would control their government. So that's what Germany had to get to, was just Paris. And then here, once again, you can see these are the attacks during the Battle of Britain. And one of the advantages for Britain is that they're an island. So um, it's a lot harder to invade someone if they are an island. Okay, so um, remember that the United States had this like history of wanting to be neutral whenever possible, not getting involved in other countries' affairs that don't concern them. So the United States, like people living in the United States, still felt like, no, we don't want to get involved in a war that's not ours. Um, However, like the U.S. government still tended to support Great Britain and France. They were natural allies. And remember that one of the ways that the United States ended up getting involved in World War One was that they had to go in and protect their investment when they had sold all these weapons and they had made all these loans. Um, so it's dangerous to sell or to loan anything to countries at war because that's going to end up getting you involved. So in 1939, Congress ends up approving a cash and carry, which allows allies to pay cash for weapons and carry them to Europe because we still wanted to make money on the war, um, but we didn't want to get involved by like we sold something. Just like in World War One of the things that drew us into the war was that the Lusitania got sunk, which had like some of our weapons and supplies on it that we were selling. And the next step toward us being in World War II is that President Roosevelt gave 50 U.S. destroyers to Great Britain in exchange for naval bases in the Caribbean. So this is kind of like a future pay it forward thing that we're going to get something in exchange in the end. In 1940, the election between Wendell Willkie, who was a Republican, and FDR gives FDR a third term, which is like normally presidents only serve 2 terms. That's been kind of like the tradition in US politics. So it's really crazy that FDR would do a third. Okay, so we're still moving toward getting involved in the war. In 1941, Congress passed the Lend-Lease Act, which actually allowed the president to loan weapons and supplies to Great Britain and later to the Soviet Union, because during the middle of the war, Soviet Union's going to switch sides. Dave, again, very dangerous for a country that doesn't want to get involved into a war to loan anybody anything. Um, and then in the Battle of the Atlantic, the Germans attacked Allied shipping, which is going to lead the U.S. Navy to start escorting convoys of supplies as far as Iceland. So again, we're officially not in the war, but we are going to start sending out like more of our forces to protect sort of the allies. And again, we're still concerned with money, so we're concerned with our shipment of stuff. In 1941, we passed the Atlantic Charter, which seems kind of strange, but Great Britain and the United States promised to work for peace at war's end. So what we were doing is we were unofficially declaring ourselves allies with Great Britain without actually entering the war. So it's kind of a weird thing. But once again, we didn't want to get involved in the war, so we were still trying to find our way like out of it. In 1940, remember Japan had been very interested in extending their territory. So when they see the war happening, they think to themselves, this will give us a reason to invade other countries. So they joined the Axis powers in 1940. The Axis, remember, was Russia and Germany, and they took over French Indochina in 1941. So Japan was mostly interested in taking over and expanding their territory. So this is where the United States is going to end up entering the war. Remember, we're still officially supposed to be neutral, but we end up freezing Japanese funds in our country and blocking oil sales to Japan. So when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, um, which was a U.S. naval base, we had like a huge, we had a bunch of our ships there. This is going to anger the United States. This pushed them too far. And the United States was already sort of leaning towards supporting the Allies. So they're going to declare war on Japan. And then because Japan was allied with Germany and the Soviet Union, they're going to be officially at war with all of them. So that's how we get involved in the war. So when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, the idea, okay, let's just find it. Okay, so here's Pearl Harbor. The idea was that Japan was already predicting that the United States was going to get involved in the war. So they thought if they like took out the U.S. Navy, which was like their biggest threat, that even if the U.S. wanted to get involved into the war, they wouldn't have like the supplies and the stuff they needed to fight anyway. So they thought they could surprise attack Pearl Harbor and like destroy the U.S. fleet, um, and then that the US would just be, you know, they would be unable to do anything. And the other thing is, if you look at like the yellow, those are all areas that Japan took over. So Japan saw the United States as a threat because they had such a big naval base in Pearl Harbor in the Pacific Ocean. They wanted to make sure that they're spreading all over the Pacific and all these different islands was unhindered. And so it was natural that the U.S. would be seen as a threat. Um, so anyway, that pretty much summarizes the beginning of the war and how the U.S. officially got involved.
We are talking about Chapter 25, Section 2. This is talking about mobilizing for war. If you guys remember, mobilizing means getting ready to move. This is when the United States finally got involved in World War II. Remember that the reason we got involved in the war was that we wanted to get revenge for Pearl Harbor. We weren't necessarily interested in going in to stop Hitler. We were more angry that the Japanese had messed with us. So one of the first things we had to do was build our army. So the United States instituted the Selective Training and Service Act, which was a law that required men from age 21 to 35, and then later they extended that to 45 to register for the draft. About 15 million Americans served in the Army, including 1 million African Americans and 300,000 Mexican Americans. Remember, there was still segregation, and people were not kind to minorities in the Army, but they still did participate. So remember that the United States was still kind of starting to recover from the Great Depression. FDR had passed the New Deal, and he had done a lot of things to try to fix the problems that had come before him. But the war officially ended the Great Depression as unemployed workers took jobs in defense-related industries. So all of our production went up. It was about 75% increase from before the war. So like it usually is, the war was really good for our economy. The government also prepared by creating the War Production Board. They supervised the conversion of factories to wartime production. So for example, some factories that maybe used to make things like soup cans or stuff like that, they would be converted to making weapons, or even the Jeep was created for World War II as a special type of utility vehicle that could go through really rough terrain. The government organized scrap drives for supplies like rubber and metal. So they wanted people to recycle everything. People needed ration coupons to buy scarce goods such as coffee and gasoline. So basically, you were limited on how much you were allowed to buy. You would get stamps or coupons. You would buy them, and that's the only thing that you'd be allowed. Like, you'd only be allowed to buy that much. They also created the Office of War Information. This is what I was telling you guys about. They were in charge of propaganda to get people to support the war. They informed the press and the public of government policies. So they would talk about like what people needed to do to support the war. And then in order to pay for the war, the government did two things. They increased income taxes and they sold war bonds, just like in World War I. Women also played a large role in the war. If you guys remember from the scavenger hunt yesterday, Rosie the Riveter was created as propaganda to get women to be willing to work in factories. She's the one that has her arm flexed. She says, "We can do it." So women took jobs in factories and offices, but they still received lower wages than men. About 300,000 women served in the armed forces. They did things from pilots to being nurses in combat areas. They still were not allowed to be in active duty as soldiers. African Americans during the war, they received the highest pay they had ever received, but they still struggled. So a lot of them actually ended up moving north to find jobs in factories because remember there was a high demand for workers in factories because all of the men who would normally be filling those jobs were drafted for the war. They experienced discrimination such as lower wages than white workers. Philip Randolph was an African American leader who planned a march on Washington to protest discrimination against African Americans. And actually his march was successful, or his plan was successful because after he agreed to cancel his march, Roosevelt created something called the Fair Employment Practices Commission to prevent discrimination in war industries and government jobs. We've already talked a little bit about braceros. So I told you guys that there were about 200,000 Mexicans that were asked to come into the United States in order to meet labor needs in agriculture in the American Southwest. So they would cross the border to come to work. And there was a lot of discrimination against them. An example of that would be the Zoot Suit riots in 1943 in Los Angeles. There were groups of U.S. sailors that attacked Mexican Americans wearing zoot suits or outfits with big baggy pants and jackets. And you can see up in the corner of the screen an example of what a zoot suit might look like. It was common for Mexicans or for African Americans to wear those, so it kind of set them apart as minorities. We've also talked about this already, but there was more than 125,000 people of Japanese descent that were living in the United States in 1941. There's two groups we typically categorize them as. There was Issei, that were immigrants that were born in Japan, and the Nisei, that were full citizens that were born in the United States. The U.S. government passed something that allowed them to capture the Japanese people living in the United States and put them in internment camps because they were afraid that they might be spies. So the government policy of relocating and imprisoning Japanese Americans that began in 1942 out of fear of espionage. Espionage means spies. Because of this, like a lot of Japanese Americans wanted to prove that they were actually loyal to the United States government. So they volunteered for military service, and most of them did see combat. I believe that is a wrap for this section. We are talking about the war in North Africa and Europe. It's chapter 25, section 3. So by the time the United States had gotten involved in World War II, it had become a desperate situation. It was late in 1941, and the German submarine attacks had made it very difficult for Allied ships on the Atlantic to get through without being taken out. Remember that the UK or England was the last holdout from Hitler, other than Russia, and otherwise he had occupied most of Europe. Axis forces occupied Greece and Yugoslavia and advanced into North Africa and the Soviet Union. So right now we've got several fronts. We've got the one between France and England. We've got the one between Russia and Germany. We've got one in North Africa, and then we also have one in the Pacific. So the United States and Great Britain decided to create a strategy to try to win the war as efficiently as possible because they were fighting on so many fronts. They needed to decide how to properly use their energies. So they decided to concentrate on defeating Germany rather than making a full attack on Japan. China and the Soviet Union also joined the Allied powers in 1942 when Hitler betrayed Stalin and he attacked Russia. It helped them out a lot in the seas and the skies because sonar and long-range bombers were able to improve the Allied situation in the North Atlantic, especially against the German Navy. Bombers attacked German factories, military centers, and railroads. Please notice that almost all of the things that we've discussed on this slide so far have to do with trying to stop supply lines. And that's going to be the same strategy that people use in future wars as well, especially in Vietnam. That was probably the primary strategy that people used. So now we're talking about North Africa, and there was a number of places in North Africa that were being fought over. One of them was in Egypt. They wanted to control shipping between East and West Europe. So there were several major generals that you should know about. Rommel was the German general. Bernard Montgomery and Dwight Eisenhower were allied. Bernard Montgomery was the British general, and Dwight Eisenhower was the U.S. general. And Erwin Rommel was really good at strategizing. A lot of times he was nicknamed Desert Fox because he was so good at creating these sneak attacks in North Africa. Bernard Montgomery and Dwight Eisenhower were able to unite and stop Rommel's advance into Egypt at the Battle of El Alamein in 1942. And finally, German forces in Africa surrendered in early 1943. So this completely allowed them to be freed up in North Africa and refocus their attention elsewhere. So then they moved on to Italy because Italy seemed like a weak link in the Axis powers. So the Allied troops landed in Sicily in July of 1943, and their goal was to push into Italy and take over. The Italian government saw them coming and they overthrew Benito Mussolini. The German resistance slowed the Allied advance into Italy, but after almost 2 years, Allied troops drove Germany out of Italy in May of 1945 and completely took over Italy. So again, German troops were there even though Benito Mussolini was no longer in power. So on the Eastern Front, I told you that a lot of times the Russian strategy was simply to just outlast their enemies and to make sure that their enemies did not have supplies when they were fighting their battles. So the Battle of Stalingrad is probably the most famous battle on the Eastern Front. It lasted for about 2 years. The town of Stalingrad was able to hold out against German forces, and eventually it ended with the German surrender to Soviet troops in January of 1943. By that time, most of German troops had already died from either battle or from exposure to the elements and lack of supplies. Soviet victory at the Battle of Kursk marked the end of German efforts to conquer the Soviet Union, and this allowed the Allied powers to completely focus on retaking the Western Front. So they decided that they would launch a huge invasion of France and try to push German forces back and put them on the defense. So George Marshall was the U.S. general who was in charge of the D-Day or the Normandy invasion of German-occupied France. The D-Day invasion of Normandy in Western France happened on June 6th of 1944. It was the largest historical air, land, and sea invasion. Omar Bradley was the general who led U.S. forces on the breakout from the Normandy beaches, and George S. Patton was the general whose tank forces broke through German supply lines in Paris. And then the Allies were able to liberate Paris from German rule on August of 1944, and after they did that, they started pushing Hitler back through Belgium. He becomes desperate to try to stop the attack, and in the Battle of the Bulge, he decides to launch one final counterattack to try to stop and retake Belgium. However, even though he killed about 77,000 Allied troops, his invasion was unsuccessful. So the Allies took heavy losses, but eventually defeated the Germans at the Battle of the Bulge, ending Germany's ability to take the offensive. By the beginning of 1945, U.S. and British troops were preparing to enter Germany from the west, while Soviet forces pushed toward Berlin from the east. So this is going to end in VE Day, which means Victory in Europe Day. So you'll notice it started with Normandy, then it led to the Battle of the Bulge, where Hitler tried to do one final counterattack, and then after that, it was kind of pretty much all downhill for Germany. Remember that Hitler committed suicide, and then the battle was officially over. This is chapter 25, section 4. The section is entitled War in the Pacific, and we're talking about the Japanese and American battles to control islands in the Pacific Ocean. So first of all, in the 1940s, Japan was pursuing a policy of expansion. They were led by General Hideki Tojo. By 1942, they had spread to control the British colonies of Hong Kong and Singapore, and had invaded the British colony of Burma, also known as Myanmar, and controlled the Dutch East Indies. Japan also captured U.S. territories in the Pacific, including Guam and Wake Islands, and invaded the Philippines. So at the time, we had been controlling the Philippines. We had won rights to control them in the Spanish-American War. So Douglas MacArthur was the U.S. general who led the American and Filipino forces. In the battles for the Philippines, the Japanese were able to overtake the Americans and Filipino forces, and they took over Manila, which is the capital of the Philippines. Roosevelt ordered MacArthur to flee with troops to Australia, but he did vow that he would return. So after MacArthur left and went to Australia with his forces, the U.S. and Filipino forces troops that remained surrendered to Japanese forces. The Japanese people who had imprisoned them took them on a 65-mile trek that a lot of people call the Bataan Death March, where they marched people to prison camps. Thousands of people died. So the estimates are between 400 and 1,000 Americans died, and possibly as many as 10,000 Filipinos. There were several major battles that were part of, sorry, I'm just trying to readjust this, were part of the U.S. and Japanese conflict. One of the major ones was called the Battle of the Coral Sea. It was led by Chester Nimitz, who was the commander of the U.S. Navy in the Pacific. Navy experts found out about a Japanese plan to attack New Guinea, which New Guinea is closer to Australia, because they had broken Japanese codes. The Battle of the Coral Sea, the U.S. planes sank a Japanese carrier and damaged another, halting Japan's advance for the first time in the war. So the Coral Sea battle was important because it was the first actual U.S. victory in the Pacific. This is going to be followed by the Battle of the Midway, where a Japanese fleet planned an attack on Midway Islands near Hawaii. In that battle, it was primarily carrier-based planes in which Japan lost 4 carriers, placing the Japanese Navy on the defensive for the rest of the war. So this takes a big hit on their ability to win. In the Battle of Guadalcanal, Guadalcanal was an island that allowed Japan to threaten sea links between Australia and the U.S. because we were allies. After months of fighting, Allies won control of Guadalcanal in early 1943. So after these major battles, the United States was able to take the offensive. So their strategy was called island hopping, where they would try to take little tiny islands and move their way toward mainland Japan, where they would launch an all-out invasion. So this began in 1943. As Allies captured islands, they would use them as bases to bomb the Japanese mainland and to attack Japanese cargo ships. The Allies were able to, they launched an attack to try to retake the Philippines in October of 1944. In the Battle of Leyte Gulf, it was the largest naval battle in history, including which the Allies greatly reduced the strength of the Japanese fleet. Allied victory in the Philippines took months as Japanese soldiers offered fierce resistance, but eventually they were able to win over the Philippines and retake. So this is the one slide that I missed for the last section. So this is still on 23.4 or 25.4. This is talking about the Japanese battles in the Pacific. So air raids in Japan caused great destruction and loss of life. In the battle for Okinawa, the Japanese crashed piloted planes into Allied ships. These kamikaze planes often caused great damages. Japanese casualties in the battle for Okinawa, over 110,000 died, while Allied soldiers lost about 12,000 and 37,000 people were wounded. The Allied victory at Okinawa set the stage for invading the Japanese homeland. Oops. Final victory in Europe. So if you recall, there had already been the D-Day invasion, and then the Battle of the Bulge failed when Hitler had tried to do one final comeback. So in 1945, the Allies bombed German cities such as Berlin, Dresden, and Hamburg. They intended to destroy German weapon factories, but they were also targeting civilians because they wanted to force the Germans to surrender. In the Allied advance, British and U.S. rushed to cross the Rhine before Germans could destroy bridges. Some Allied leaders wanted to occupy as much as Germany as possible to keep the territory out of Soviet control, because the fear was that if the Soviets were able to take it, they would turn it into a communist country, which actually did happen. As Soviets moved toward Berlin, Hitler committed suicide, knowing that they were about to be defeated. So the German authorities surrendered unconditionally. And let me just make sure I've got the right date on that. So May 8th of 1945 was officially known as Victory in Europe Day, because that is when the European theater was finished. Harry S. Truman was president, having taken office after Franklin Roosevelt died in April of 1945. An Allied invasion of Japan would cost many lives, so many people were afraid that if the U.S. soldiers did that, that women and children would be prepared to fight, and that even more casualties would have happened. So the U.S. government had been developing an atom bomb secretly, which worked by splitting atoms. It was called the Manhattan Project, and it employed more than 600,000 people and cost about $2 billion to build. It was successfully tested in New Mexico on July 16th of 1945. And finally, Truman decided to use the bomb after Japanese leaders refused an unconditional surrender after the United States had been firebombing them excessively. On August 6th of 1945, a U.S. plane dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima, Japan. A second bomb was dropped on Nagasaki, Japan on August 9th of 1945 after leaders reiterated that they would not surrender. And so finally, Japan surrendered. So, the war, World War II cost the lives of some 50 million people, many of them civilians. The war devastated the economies of Asia, Europe, and the Soviet Union, and the United States emerged as the most powerful economy in the world, and they also had the most powerful military in the world because they had now shown that they had the atom bomb.